Okay, it's time to replicate our defect in a test. Here's where we'll start. We add our test annotation and we come up with a name for our test. I know that what I want to ultimately be the case is that the score of my game stays the same if I start it and then rotate my device. So let's say game retains score. That's what I want to have happen. Underscore when device rotates. Great. Now I know that my test needs to have three parts: given, when, then. Now, what might this look like? Well, how do we test this manually? We launch our activity, we tap the button a few times to make the score go up and start the game, and then we rotate the device to see if everything stays the way that it should. And of course, right now it doesn't. What we can do is attempt to automate that exact same flow. So in our previous tests, we already set up a testable activity, get a hold of our items, tap to start the game, assert that the score is 1. So maybe, actually, we can do all of those steps again. Now, we want to rotate the device. And this is where things get a little bit tricky because we need to call additional lifecycle methods on our system under test, but we have extracted control over our activity into the separate method set up testable activity. This is an example of why I tend to be slow to consolidate duplicated lines of code, because now we've run into a situation where we need to do this, but then we need to do something slightly different with this controller than we have in the past. We don't have access to that in this method because we haven't returned that from this method that we've extracted. So instead of using setup testable activity like we do right here, instead, I'm going to copy these lines from my extracted method and I'm going to paste them into my test so that I have access to this controller object. Once again, it's easier to consolidate duplicated lines of code when we know that they're truly being used in identical situations than it is to extract them into separate situations after we realize that we've refactored prematurely. So now we have access to a controller and a system under test inside of game retains score. We call our perform click on the tap me button. We make sure that our score is 1, and then we want to rotate the device, and after that, ensure that our score is still equal to 1. What I'd actually like to do here is have a little bit of fun with this. So I'm going to hit Command D for duplicate line on tap me button.perform click. Hit Command D again to duplicate it again, and ensure that my score at this point is 3. So now it's time for us to rotate the device, and we'll do that by calling the relevant lifecycle methods directly. Now to do this, I'm going to take a look at some documentation. The Robolectric documentation tells us a little bit about how this might be done. Let's see. Robolectric save instance state. So I see a lot of Stack Overflow answers. I don't want that, so I'm going to say minus Stack Overflow. I want to see what Robolectric itself has to say about this. So now I can look at this activity controller, and I'm going to search in this page for save instance state. I see the documentation. Now this is great. Documentation tells me about what my options might be as I'm using an API, but what I'd really like to see right now is an example. And so I happen to be familiar with a guide from CodePath that talks about unit testing with Robolectric. Let me move this over here so you can see it. Okay, overview to Robolectric. Let's look at my table of contents right here. It says testing the activity lifecycle, simulating a phone call, simulating a device rotation. That's what I want to look at. Okay, so it looks like I need to create a bundle and then save the instance state with that bundle, stop and destroy my activity, and then start a new one with that bundle. So let's give this a try. I'm going to copy those lines of code. Convert code from Java to Kotlin, yes. Great. Okay, I'm going to remove. So we create our bundle. We call controller that we previously declared to save the instance state with that bundle. We're going to destroy everything. And then controller equals robolectric.buildActivity, MainActivity, same things. And then we reassign activity to controller.get, with the difference being that we restore our instance state with the bundle that we saved our instance state to previously. Once our app is working correctly, the information about the score is going to be stored in that bundle. So now I'm going to copy this, throw it in here, convert from Java to Kotlin with the automatic converter. And we see that this is called activity, which isn't declared. Reason for that being that we call our activity system under test. So we'll change this to system under test. I'm going to hit F2 to go back up to this error. It's taking me through a bunch of stuff. Value cannot be reassigned. So we need to change system under test from a val to a var so we can reassign it. Now we should be fine. And we're going to assert that our score is 3 at this point. Now I'm going to move my window a little bit to the right here so that you can see for a fact which tests are passing and failing for me. All right, I've got my cursor in the in between the tests, so the full test suite will run when I hit Control-Shift-R. And now we'll see what happens. Only safe or non-null asserted calls are allowable on a nullable receiver of type MainActivity. Here's what we'll do, is we'll ensure that MainActivity is always present. Let's try running it again. Control-R. Instantiating the tests. Pass, pass, pass. Interesting. This is, in fact, not what we want, because we want our test to be able to replicate the problem that we're seeing when we look at the app ourselves, which is that when we start the game and rotate the device, the score is reset to 0 rather than to 3. In this case, the problem happens to be that we need to duplicate one more line. On line 55 up here, we set our scoreTextView. That scoreTextView we get from a view that we found by its ID in system under test. But at that point, system under test was our main activity that we made the first time around, the one that was destroyed when we rotated the device. Even though we reassigned system under test down here, currently the variable scoreTextView is still pointing to the text view that existed on that older activity that we destroyed. So there's a couple things that we can do here. First, I want to change the val of scoreTextView up here to var so that I can reassign this variable. Then I'm going to take that line, Command D for duplicate. Let me undo that and unhighlight the line and do it again. There we go. And now I'll use Option Shift down to bring it all the way down below where we reassign system under test. I'm going to remove var so I can reassign. I'm also going to name this more clearly. So instead of system under test getting reassigned here, I'm going to instead say val recreated system under test. And I'm going to access recreated system under test's view in my assertion on line 80. Let's try that again. Control-Shift-R. Run the test. This time it fails. Let's take a look at what the failure was. A comparison failure. It expected your score to be 3, but instead it was 0. So we've successfully replicated our issue in an automated test. This is great. Now we have a faster feedback loop for debugging, and we can make sure that once we have this fixed, it doesn't break again as a result of further changes to the application.